Hi, this lecture will introduce a new philosopher, Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia, and we're going to focus on how she presented a significant challenge to Descartes' view of the mind. Princess Elisabeth was a 17th century philosopher whose father was Frederick V, Prince of Bohemia, hence Princess Elisabeth of Bohemia, but her mother was Elizabeth Stuart, of the Stuart family from England. This royal heritage is worth noting because she had a lot of connections in virtue of that royal heritage. So she received education from very prominent people, and throughout her life, she would make connections with prominent scholars and religious figures. Unlike most women who were deprived of an education in the 17th century, she received a fairly expansive education, and specifically, she received an education in ancient Greek thought, and so she learned the ancient Greek language, and she received the nickname La Grecque due to her extensive knowledge of Greek thought as well as her love of it. She lived in a few different places, including Germany and the Netherlands, and that made it possible as well to make connections with a variety of figures. We are focusing on her correspondence with Descartes. We also have extant correspondence with other figures, and it's her correspondence through which we know about her thought. She didn't write her own treatises or books. As we discover in the correspondence with Descartes, she has an interest in understanding the nature of the mind and how it relates to the body, but the correspondence goes on to tackle other topics, such as the good life, and a consideration of ancient Greek Stoicism. Much of her concern here with the good life and the relationship between mind and body amounts to a concern with emotions. Emotions are a phenomenon that unites mind and body together, and they're also of prominent importance for having a good life. And so she developed some thoughts about the emotions, but she also prompted Descartes to write his book, The Passions of the Soul. And so passion is the term at the time for emotion. The understanding there is that the soul or mind is passive with respect to the emotions it has. So, for example, you are overcome with anger, you're beside yourself, you cannot help it. And so that means anger is something that you passively undergo. And that's the model of the emotions at the time. So if we are to have a good account of emotions, we need to have a good account of how mind and body relate metaphysically. So that's what Elisabeth writes to Descartes about. Her question is this, quote, "Tell me how the soul of a man can determine the bodily spirits to make voluntary actions, the soul being only a thinking substance." Now, a few things are worth noting about her question. First of all, when she uses that term spirit, that's a term at the time that was used in scientific texts, and it basically amounted to the nervous system. So we talk about bodily spirits. Those are things that convey information from one part of the body to another, convey sensations from one part of the body to another. That's all that's meant by spirit. It's not some spooky entity. Now, what is she concerned about with respect to bodily spirits? She's concerned with how the soul can determine those bodily spirits, determine the nervous system to produce voluntary actions. So the focus is on how the soul affects the body. How the soul, you make a decision after some reflection and deliberation, you make a decision to raise your hand, for example. Well, that action is a voluntary one since it came from your mind's will. And her question is, how can the mind, being only a thinking substance and not made of matter, how could it have an effect on these bodily spirits, which are made of matter? So that's the important thing to note. The spirits are made of matter despite what we might normally think of as a spirit. So that's Elisabeth's question, but she explains why it's an important question and she reveals an insight into a problem that Descartes has. She sets up the problem or worry that she has as follows. Quote, "For it seems that all determination of motion occurs through one of three factors." So when she says determination of motion, like spirit, is a sort of different term here than what we mean by it. Motion refers to any kind of change. So we're not just thinking about one thing moving from one place to another, like locomotion. Rather, when we're considering motion, we're thinking of all change whatsoever. So your hair changes color when you grow old. Well, that's a motion in the philosophical sense at the time. So what she's doing here is providing an account of the different ways in which changes can be produced. So the three ways that motion is produced are as follows. First, there's impulsion. So impulsion is just one thing pushing another. So just think push. The second way that motion or change occurs is through qualities that are had by the thing that causes the change. For example, you might think here of the quality of being hot. That quality of being hot can warm up something else, cause a change, as in baking. And there are other qualities, of course, besides being hot, but they're the various sorts of properties of matter that scientists would investigate. Now, the third way in which motion or change occurs is through shape. So think here, for example, the shape of a knife versus the shape of a club. So if you take a knife to a piece of wood, it will cut through it, at least if it's sharp enough. But a club is not going to cut through it. It doesn't have the proper shape. So the kind of change that a piece of wood might undergo by being cut or hit by a knife or a club depends on the shape of the thing that you're hitting it with. So Elisabeth's point here is that these are the three ways in which motion or change can occur, how one thing can cause a change in a different thing. But then she points out what is required for each of these three things. She says for the first two things, for impulsion or pushing and qualities, physical contact is required. One thing has to touch another for a change to occur. For the third, for shape, that depends on extension. And recall that extension means being extended in space, having 3 dimensions in space. And she goes on to point out that these requirements for the 3 types of change are not compatible with what a soul is according to Descartes. As we saw previously, according to Descartes, a soul or mind is not extended. Therefore, it doesn't have a shape, and therefore it can't cause a change in the body by having a shape. But likewise, since it's not made of a stuff, a material, it cannot make contact with the body. For example, the soul being immaterial cannot push the arm to raise. So what does all this mean? We can understand Princess Elisabeth's point by considering how she has an implicit argument against Descartes' view. Basically, she's pointing out that Descartes doesn't have a good account of voluntary action, and that he doesn't have the resources to provide one. So the implicit argument would run as follows. Interaction in general between two things, one thing causing an effect or change in another, that can occur only by means of contact or extension. But an immaterial mind cannot make contact, doesn't have extension, and so an immaterial mind cannot interact with a body at all, let alone cause a voluntary action. Elisabeth's focusing on primarily the mind causing a change in the body, but this is a more general argument. Basically, Descartes doesn't have the resources to explain how a change in the body, a change in one's stomach, it's empty, how that would cause a change in one's mind, the feeling of hunger. Because there's no bridge between mind and body on Descartes' account. Now, there's a further implied conclusion of this argument. Since it's obvious that the mind and body interact, it must follow that the mind is not immaterial. We know that the mind and body interact. We know that the mind has changes on the body and that the body makes changes on the mind. And the only way to explain that is if they're alike in some way. And it seems like they're alike in being material. It seems like that would solve our problem. Now, that's a pretty formidable challenge to Descartes. But Elisabeth suggests one way in which Descartes could try to overcome the challenge. So what she writes is that Descartes should provide a better definition of the soul. Descartes' definition of the soul, recall, is that the soul or mind is a thinking thing. And what Descartes has done is characterize the soul in terms of what it does, the type of action it performs. But we can have a better definition if we know what it is, not what action performs, but what it's made of. Lacking an account of what it's made of was what led to the problem. The fact that the mind is not made up of matter meant that it could not interact with material things such as the body. So what she says is that if we have this definition saying what the soul or mind is and not just what it does, we would have a more perfect idea of the soul and mind, more complete idea of it. Notice that in the passage I give on the slide, she also raises another problem for Descartes. She writes that Descartes has supposed the soul and its action to be inseparable. And that fits with Descartes' statement that the soul is a thinking thing. But then she points out in her parenthetical remark that this is difficult to prove for the mother's womb and great fainting spells. Now, what is she saying there? Well, the idea here is that if you faint, you still have a soul, but the soul's not thinking. You've lost consciousness. Or the child in the mother's womb has a soul, but it is not yet thinking. It's not yet performing the action. What this means is that not only is Descartes' definition of the soul as a thinking thing insufficient, it's also wrong. There must be something to explain how the soul thinks at some times, but not at others. And what that means again is that Descartes needs to say what kind of thing the soul is, what it's made of. In the next lecture, we'll see how Descartes responds to Elisabeth's challenge.